Hello and welcome to Saki Tech. So the new iPad Air 2 is out as of November 2014, and in this video we will do a full comparison between this new contender and the year-old iPad Air, which was released in November 2013. There are certainly some notable upgrades on the new iPad Air 2 which might prompt you to upgrade from an Air. So let's quickly dive into some details, and we will start with the build and design. Both the Air and Air 2 are designed and built similarly. When you hold these iPads in your hand, they will feel like $1,000,000. There's no question about that. They are both thin and light, and they're an absolute pleasure to hold. And, as is typical with Apple products, they offer a superior in-hand feel. So design-wise, there isn't much of a difference. Let's quickly look at the size and weight difference. So the iPad Air measures 9.4 inches in height. It is 6.6 inches wide and only 0.29 inches thick, while the iPad Air 2 measures 9.4 inches in height. It is 6.6 inches wide and only 0.24 inches thick. Now the iPad Air weighs 469 grams, while the iPad Air 2 weighs 437 grams. So, looking at these numbers, it is obvious that while the height and width remain exactly the same, iPad Air 2 is in fact the thinner and lighter device. Is this a big deal? No. Design, dimension, and weight are the last reasons you should want to upgrade your iPad, since iPad Air itself is already quite thin and light. So let's move on to the processor, memory, and graphics, which just might be a good reason to upgrade for gamers and power users. So the old iPad Air comes with a dual-core 64-bit A7 processor clocked at 1.4 GHz with 1 GB of RAM, and IMG's PowerVR G6430 for the GPU, which is the graphics processor. The new iPad Air 2 comes with a new and improved tri-core 64-bit A8X processor clocked at 1.5 GHz with 2 GB of RAM, and the PowerVR GX6650 for the GPU. Yes, we finally get more than 2 cores, where tri-core stands for 3 cores, and we also get 2 GB of RAM. Let's dig a little deeper. So the iPad Air still is a powerhouse, and it will be able to run demanding apps and games without any hiccups. However, it is also a fact that compared with the A7 chip in the previous iPad Air, the new A8X chip delivers 40% faster CPU performance and 2.5 times faster graphics performance. So what does this mean for the consumer? Video editing apps, modeling apps, design apps, and games will simply perform faster. There is also the new technology known as Metal that allows game developers to create and deliver console-level graphics to the iPad Air. So yeah, if you're a heavy iPad gamer, by all means upgrade. You will be seeing some really good-looking iPad games based on the new Metal technology. And as I also mentioned, video editing apps such as the iMovie will simply perform faster. So if you were exporting a movie, the movie will export faster in the iPad Air 2 than the iPad Air, and that is going to be guaranteed. At the end of this video, I will run a processor, memory, and graphics benchmark, and we will compare the difference in performance firsthand based on raw horsepower. For now, let's move on to the display. Now in the display department, nothing major has happened. Both iPad Airs will sport the 2048 by 1536 resolution at 264 pixels per inches on a 9.7-inch IPS display. The only new feature worth mentioning is the addition of the anti-reflective coating on the new Air 2, which reduces reflections by 56%. So you'll be able to see your screen easier than before in daylight conditions. However, this update can be considered minor and should have no bearing on your buying decision between the two, unless of course you were itching for this specific feature update, which I doubt you were. Alright, so next let's talk about the camera. So we have a rather notable upgrade for the rear camera, which gets a bump from a 5-megapixel iSight camera to an 8-megapixel iSight camera on the Air 2. Not only do we get an upgrade in the megapixel count, but thanks to the A8X chip, you get better image processing, which will reduce overall noise in your pictures, getting you sharper and clearer results. New features on the iPad Air 2 also include the ability to take 43 megapixel panorama shots, a burst mode that captures 10 photos per second, time-lapse videos, and 120 frame rates per second slow motion videos at 720p. Standard video capture remains at 1080p recording capability on both iPads using the rear camera and 720p using the FaceTime camera. The front-facing FaceTime camera is basically unchanged with the same 1.2 megapixel sensor. However, you now get a wider f2.2 aperture which will allow in more light, resulting in better low-light photos. But only slightly better, nothing special here. The only real upgrade here is the new 8 megapixel sensor. If you do love using cameras on your tablet, this upgrade might worth slight consideration. Otherwise, if like me, you never touch your tablet's camera, this is not going to matter in choosing between the two or doing an upgrade. As a final comparison metric, let's take a look at what the iPad Air 2 has that the iPad Air does not. So the iPad Air 2 has Touch ID and Apple Pay capabilities. These are 100% new to the iPad Air 2. A few comments on those. Touch ID is definitely a fantastic way to secure your device, but what really differentiates it is how easy and seamless it is to use. Unlocking your iPad Air 2 with your finger is a breeze. You can also use Touch ID to make one-touch purchases in iTunes, iBooks, and the App Store. As for Apple Pay, you get a limited version. With the iPhone 6, you can use Apple Pay to make purchases in physical stores using the Tap to Pay feature. But with the iPad Air, the Apple Pay functionality is limited to apps that actually enable Apple Pay. And if they do enable Apple Pay, you will be able to scan your finger using the Touch ID sensor to make purchases inside of a shopping app. And that is the extent of Apple Pay in an iPad Air 2. As for battery life, you get the same battery life on both iPads. You get 10 hours of surfing the web on Wi-Fi, watching video, or listening to music, which is a nice combination of an average day of use. Capacity-wise, the iPad Air 2 has a smaller battery. It is only 27.62 watt-hours as opposed to the 32.9 watt-hours on the original iPad Air. But because of the efficiency of the A8X chip, the battery life comes out to be similar in average day-to-day use. And I'm sure that you guys are aware that the iPad Air 1 and 2 run on the latest version of iOS, which is iOS 8.1, which is super smooth and super responsive on both of these tablets. Alright, so finally let's run some benchmarks. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Geekbench 3 benchmarking tool to measure the processor and memory performance on both of these devices. And first of all, I'm just going to make sure everything is cleared in the background, that nothing is running. So let's launch Geekbench on both of these guys. Oops. There we go. And let's run the benchmark. Let's start on the iPad 1 first. And that's the iPad 2. So the one on the left is the iPad 2. And the one on the right is the iPad 1. The Air 1 and Air 2, of course. Alright, so the iPad Air 2 is done. Let's move that aside. And 1 is done as well. So let's take a look at the single core performance. At single core, iPad Air 2 has 1815, whereas the iPad Air 1 has 1470. Not a big difference here. But when you move on to the multi-core score, which actually matters, you have iPad Air 2 significantly faster at 4509, whereas the iPad Air 1 is 2656. That's almost twice as fast in raw performance. Okay, so you do get a perfect CPU boost with the iPad Air 2, and that is why I think the only reason you would want to upgrade is if you want a faster processor and faster graphics. Now let's move on to a graphics benchmark really quickly. We are going to use the 3D Mark utility, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to start the test, and I'm going to fast forward to the results, and we're going to look at the final numbers on both of these devices. So let's do a run and run, and I'm going to skip to the final numbers right away. So looking at the final scores, we get 21806 on the iPad Air 2 and 15669 on the iPad Air 1. So again, the winner obviously is the iPad Air 2. You're going to get a nice, beautiful graphics boost with the iPad Air 2. So the question is it worth an upgrade? In all honesty, I think the only improvement on the iPad Air 2 that is worth an upgrade is the bump in power. The faster tri-core processor, 2 gigabytes of RAM, the updated graphics, and the metal technology will deliver faster performance in demanding apps and intense games. Beyond that, however, to me, the camera, the slightly thinner form factor, or the Touch ID sensor isn't much of an upgrade. It would be worth it if you're coming from a pre-iPad Air, such as the iPad 3 or the iPad 4. Then I would say go ahead and upgrade. But I would not recommend it if you already own an iPad Air. Unless, again, if you want the latest in performance boost, yes, upgrade. If not, just keep your iPad Air. But if you do have older iPads, pre-iPad Air iPads I mean, then go ahead and upgrade right now.